I think it came as a bit of a surprise because there was no real advance warning that the drastic change in the situation in West Asia would open the doors for such an initiative by India, Israel, UAE, and the US. It's remarkable how in just 1 year, the relationship between the conservative Gulf monarchies and Israel, as a result of the Abraham Accords, has changed so much, with Israel and UAE establishing diplomatic ties, US, Israel, UAE, and India getting together means that the interests and the strengths that each of the country brings into this region collectively can form the basis of very considerable progress on economic and trade ties, technology ties, even issues like maritime security. So the field is now open, and as you know, the four countries have agreed to nominate senior professionals who would then work together on this agenda. So the outlook is positive, but since this is just the beginning, one cannot at this moment fully anticipate what lies ahead. But as I said, the perspectives are very positive indeed. The United States, as you know, has got the fifth fleet in this area. They have bases in this area in Bahrain and Qatar. So they are very powerful physical force in this region in the naval domain. So they are obviously interested in maritime security. And of course, don't forget that this region is part of the Indian Ocean. So when we talk about the Indo-Pacific, then this region is very much part of it. Yes, to the extent that China and Pakistan are collaborating on this CPEC and Gwadar, which gives the possibility of China expanding its naval presence in this region, the China factor in the maritime security domain therefore becomes relevant. India and the UAE have a very large trade relationship. We have important energy ties. In fact, going back to the trade relationship, at one time, UAE and probably still is amongst our leading trade partners, not necessarily for the UAE market itself, but as a base for our larger regional penetration in the Gulf. There are 3 million Indians in the UAE. The air connections are very strong. But coming back to the energy partnership, as you know, UAE as well as Saudi Arabia, they are involved in building up strategic petroleum reserves. At the same time, India and Israel have built up a strong trade relationship, and in the sense that in the water sector, in the agriculture sector, there is considerable cooperation going on between the two countries. Potentially, there is a scope also for some sort of an energy relationship because Israel has discovered quite a lot of gas. United States is, as you know, has always played a very key and critical role in the energy sector in this region. Now they are, of course, becoming self-sufficient in oil and gas, so their reliance on this region has become less. But for global stability of oil and natural gas supplies, United States still has a vital interest, so they're not going to simply withdraw from the region. So all this is part of a larger trade and economic and investment relationship. There's so many elements that are there in our closer ties with these countries and this region, which will serve our strategic interests. First of all, our manpower. So we have about 7-8 million expatriates in this region. So we want to promote stability in this region to the extent that we can, because we don't want to expose our large expatriate population to instability. Number one. Number two, oil is a very strategic element. We will still be reliant on oil for several decades. India is, along with China, the biggest oil importer in the world. We have big plans for natural gas, and the natural gas is also coming from this region, from Qatar is a big supplier. So energy, which is very strategic, is a very important element in our relationship going ahead. Three, maritime security, defense of this region. You know, our Prime Minister stated in his address to the United Nations Security Council when we were chairing it, that India is a net security provider in the region. I don't recall any Prime Minister of India having used this phrase before, which means that we are willing to accept greater responsibility for the defense of this region. We are willing to do burden sharing, which means that in terms of maritime security and bilateral ties with countries like UAE, even in the defense sector, and with Israel, which actually is flourishing, there is a long-term strategic interest. It's also important that the sea lanes of communication continue to be protected, that oil flow is not disrupted.